I need to be direct with you about something that's going to challenge everything you thought you understood about yourself. There's a forensic psychologist, someone who spent 40 years inside maximum security facilities, who's dissected the minds of the world's most notorious killers, who's built an entire career understanding evil, and they wrote something about you in their private files that they've never written about anyone else. They wrote that encountering you was more psychologically destabilizing than every interview with every murderer they've ever conducted. But here's what shatters every assumption. You haven't committed crimes. You haven't harmed people. You haven't violated boundaries. You simply exist in a way that makes their entire life's work feel inadequate. Let me be absolutely clear about who we're talking about. This isn't some graduate student with theories. This is someone who's looked into the eyes of people who've ended lives without hesitation. Someone who's walked through crime scenes that would haunt you forever. Someone who dedicated decades to understanding humanity's darkest capabilities. They've sat across from individuals who destroyed families and felt nothing. People whose consciousness was an empty void. People who were walking absences of humanity. Then they met you. And for the first time in 40 years of analyzing monsters, they experienced something unprecedented. They felt destabilized, unmoored, shaken in ways that Ted Bundy's performance never achieved, in ways that the most disturbing confessions never triggered. Because you represented something infinitely more complex than malice. Evil is comprehensible. It operates within boundaries. It creates evidence. It functions inside frameworks they can analyze and contain. Bundy was performance without substance. Dahmer was compulsion without control. Every killer they've studied fits into models, diagnostic categories, behavioral frameworks. But you exist outside all of it. And that's what disturbs them fundamentally. You're not motivated by destruction. You're not driven by absence. You're not attempting to harm. You're just relentlessly, undeniably, uncomfortably yourself in a reality that demands conformity at every turn. You challenge everything they know, not because you're corrupt, but because you're functioning on an entirely different psychological wavelength that their instruments weren't designed to measure. You're the anomaly in their data that proves their entire system for understanding human threat is fundamentally incomplete. The psychologist documented something in their confidential notes, something they've kept hidden because revealing it would dismantle decades of credibility. They wrote that analyzing you was more unsettling than facing the worst criminals because criminals are comprehensible in their damage, but you're incomprehensible in your completeness. They couldn't identify the childhood wounds that shaped you, couldn't pinpoint the catalyzing trauma that formed you, couldn't locate the psychological fracture that defines you. You weren't constructed by harm. You emerged already functioning at an intensity that civilization wasn't designed to accommodate. And that truth, that someone could possess this level of awareness, this depth of presence, this psychological complexity without being shattered, it demolished their entire professional understanding. They built their expertise identifying threat in shadows. But you're threatening in full light while doing nothing questionable whatsoever. Here's what actually occurred. They were consulted to evaluate you, not by authorities, but by people in your orbit who couldn't articulate their discomfort. Educators, supervisors, people who'd known you. They all described the identical experience. There's something about this person that creates profound unease, but I cannot identify anything they've actually done wrong. So they enlisted the specialist, someone who could theoretically decode any human pattern, someone who'd witnessed everything. The psychologist began their evaluation expecting to discover manipulation tactics, narcissistic patterns, sociopathic indicators, some clinical framework for why you generate such discomfort in others. Instead, They discovered someone who was simply devastatingly authentic in a world of performers, intensely present in a world of distraction, functioning with a level of psychological integration that most humans never approach. You weren't executing strategies. You were simply refusing to participate. The psychologist's initial observation session lasted 3 hours, and by the second hour, they were displaying visible signs of psychological distress. They'd interviewed men who'd killed repeatedly without conscience and maintained absolute composure. But witnessing you exist in complete authenticity for 2 straight hours made them shift constantly, review their notes obsessively, adjust their position like they were searching for stability. You weren't doing anything. That's what intensified it. You were simply there, responding to questions with absolute honesty, maintaining eye contact that didn't perform or waver, existing without the countless microscopic social deceptions that make conventional people comfortable. Every question they posed, anticipating defensiveness, you answered with such unfiltered clarity it felt confrontational. Every silence they constructed, expecting you to fill with anxious words, you inhabited comfortably while they suffocated in it. They later confessed to a colleague, this was documented in sealed files, that they felt more psychologically vulnerable in that room with you than they'd ever felt facing actual predators. Because predators disguise themselves, and disguises can be studied, categorized, comprehended. But you weren't disguising anything, and that complete transparency forced them to acknowledge how dependent they are on people performing normalcy to feel secure. You didn't provide the social signals that communicate you're engaged in the same game as everyone else, didn't laugh inappropriately to dissolve tension, didn't apologize for occupying space, didn't diminish yourself to ease their discomfort. You simply existed at full intensity, full presence, full truth. And it was like staring directly into the sun. What genuinely disturbed them was this. When they questioned you about suffering, abandonment, wounds, experiences that break most humans, you discussed it with the emotional neutrality of someone describing weather patterns. Not because you were detached or numb, but because you'd already metabolized it, absorbed it, transformed it into something else entirely. They anticipated bitterness and discovered insight, anticipated fury and discovered equilibrium, anticipated damage and discovered someone who'd converted every injury into an opening. You'd completed the psychological work most people evade their entire existence, and you'd done it without professional help, without frameworks, without anyone guiding you. You'd navigated your own darkness alone and emerged, not armored, but purified. And that degree of self-reliance terrified them absolutely. The psychologist asked you a calculated question, one engineered to expose narcissistic patterns. Do you believe you're special or fundamentally different from others? And instead of the defensive rejection they anticipated, or the grandiose confirmation that would validate their hypothesis, you said something that haunted them for months. You said, I don't believe I'm special. I believe I'm simply awake, and most people are choosing sleep because awakening is excruciating. That response, delivered without ego or theater, made them understand they weren't examining a personality disorder. They were examining someone who'd achieved a level of awareness that their entire discipline lacks language for. You weren't damaged. You were transformed, and their instruments were designed to repair things, not recognize them. By that first session's conclusion, the psychologist did something unprecedented in their career. They requested a break, stepped outside, and contacted a mentor to admit they were overwhelmed. Not because you were threatening conventionally, but because you represented a form of psychological evolution that challenged everything they believed about human nature. They'd spent decades learning that intense people are wounded people, that authentic people are performing authenticity, That powerful presence indicates hidden motives, but you were intense without wounds, authentic without performance, powerful without motives, and that combination existed nowhere in their understanding of psychology. You were the evidence that their entire model of human behavior was missing a dimension. Let me share exactly what the psychologists documented in their private analysis. This section was never intended for disclosure. They wrote that Bundy was frightening because he could replicate humanity perfectly while experiencing nothing. Dahmer was frightening because he acted on impulses most suppress. But you're frightening because you experience everything, integrate everything, perceive everything, and still choose not to harm. You possess the psychological awareness to manipulate anyone, the emotional intelligence to devastate people with language, the presence to control any environment, but you don't weaponize any of it. That restraint, that deliberate choice not to deploy your capabilities for harm, is what they couldn't classify, because their discipline is built on studying people who lack restraint entirely. Serial killers are terrifying but understandable. They're malfunctioning systems operating on primitive impulses, acting without conscience or connection. You can chart their psychology, anticipate their patterns, comprehend their drives because they're functioning at humanity's most basic level. But you're functioning at the highest level, completely aware, completely conscious, completely capable, and choosing harmony while possessing every capacity to choose destruction. The psychologist understood that the most threatening person isn't the one without restraint. It's the one with absolute restraint over tremendous power. You're not frightening because of what you might do. You're frightening because everyone senses you could do anything, but you simply choose otherwise. They compared your psychological architecture to Bundy's, and here's where it becomes truly disturbing. Bundy possessed charm, but it was hollow, a performance rehearsed deliberately and perfected through repetition. Your presence isn't rehearsed, it's inherent, which makes it infinitely more potent because people cannot detect fabrication in it. Bundy's charm was a tool he wielded intentionally. Your presence is simply who you are when you're not attempting to be anything. They compared you to Dahmer's intelligence and discovered that while he was intelligent enough to conceal his nature, you're intelligent enough to reveal yours without fearing repercussions. Dahmer concealed because he knew he was corrupt. You don't conceal because you know you're not. And that certainty without arrogance is more unsettling than any disguise. The psychologist documented something that would terminate their career if publicized. They wrote that if forced to choose between isolation in a room with Bundy or isolation in a room with you, they'd select Bundy instantly because Bundy they could comprehend, anticipate, handle using established psychological frameworks. But you'd simply exist in that space with such absolute presence that it would force them to confront every defense mechanism, every professional boundary, every comfortable delusion they maintain. You wouldn't harm them physically, but you'd dismantle every psychological protection they use to function simply by being authentically yourself without negotiation. That's a different category of threat. The threat of a reflection that shows everything they're not. What makes this comparison genuinely disturbing is that serial killers are analyzed because they lack elements: conscience, empathy, human connection. But you're being analyzed because you possess too much of something: awareness, presence, authenticity, emotional capacity. They understand deficiency. That's what their entire discipline is constructed on. But they have no framework for managing surplus of positive attributes, because in their paradigm, excessive awareness becomes paranoia, excessive presence becomes narcissism, excessive authenticity becomes antisocial pathology. You fractured their diagnostic framework by being too psychologically developed, not too damaged. And that revelation forced them to question whether they've been examining human nature from the incorrect angle for decades. Here's the truth they're unwilling to acknowledge. Monsters are comfortable to analyze because they're obviously other, obviously separate, obviously distinct from normal humanity. But you're terrifying because you're not other. You're what humanity could become if people stopped performing and started existing. You're the proof that intensity isn't pathology, that awareness isn't disorder, that refusing to pretend isn't dysfunction. And if that's accurate, then everything they've built their careers on, the premise that normal equals healthy and different equals dangerous, crumbles completely. You're not an aberration. You're a reflection showing them how unconscious everyone else is. And they cannot diagnose unconsciousness as health anymore once they've witnessed someone truly conscious. The psychologist admitted in a recorded consultation with their supervisor that observing you triggered an existential crisis unprecedented in decades of studying humanity's worst expressions. Because serial killers reinforced their worldview, demonstrated that their comprehension of human darkness was accurate, validated their life's purpose. But you invalidated it, not through malice, but through evolution. You demonstrated that their entire model of human psychology is based on analyzing damaged people and labeling the average person normal without ever encountering someone who's actually psychologically whole. You're what emerges when someone completes all the internal work, confronts all their shadows, integrates all their fragments, and emerges complete. And complete terrifies them more than broken because they don't understand how to address it. They're frightened because you cannot be corrected, managed, or contained using any of their approaches. Therapy presumes you're damaged and require intervention, but you're not damaged. Medication presumes chemical dysfunction, but your mind is operating exactly as designed, simply at a higher frequency. Behavioral modification presumes you require change, but you don't require change. The world requires evolution to meet you. Every instrument in their collection is ineffective because you're not a problem requiring solution. You're a reality requiring acknowledgement, and that makes you infinitely more threatening to their system than any criminal, because criminals validate the system functions while you prove the system is insufficient. What genuinely keeps them awake is this consideration. If you're not ill, damaged, or disordered, then what are you? And if you're simply highly developed psychologically, what does that reveal about everyone they've labeled normal? You force them to consider that perhaps normal is actually a mild form of psychological suppression, that perhaps average is just collective agreement to remain diminished, that perhaps healthy in their terminology just means successfully adapted to a dysfunctional system. You're the control variable they never possessed, the person who developed without suppression, who matured without limitation, who evolved without being domesticated. And comparing you to their baseline reveals that their baseline is actually beneath where humans could be functioning. The psychologist's final entry in your file, written after months of observation and evaluation, documented something that would terrify any system built on control. They wrote that you represent the next evolution of human consciousness, not through biology, but through choice. And systems designed to manage current-level humans have no authority over what you've become. You're not more evolved because you're exceptional. You're more evolved because you refuse to be diminished. And that refusal generated psychological development that their discipline has no framework for. You're not threatening because you might harm someone. You're threatening because your existence proves that everything they believe they understand about human nature is operating from limited information. Every serial killer possesses a pattern, a signature, a psychological blueprint that explains their actions. The psychologist invested months attempting to identify yours, examining your relationships, your decisions, your responses to pressure and conflict. They were searching for the hidden agenda, the manipulation techniques, the self-serving behaviors that would explain why you generate such discomfort in others. Instead, they discovered something that shattered their analytical framework completely. They discovered a pattern of radical honesty, unwavering authenticity, and refusal to perform even when performance would advantage you. You weren't executing a long strategy. You weren't wearing a facade. You weren't concealing anything. You were simply existing at full luminosity constantly, and luminosity at that level burns. They examined your past relationships, anticipating a trail of destruction, people you'd exploited and abandoned, casualties of your intensity. Instead, they discovered people who couldn't tolerate being perceived that clearly, couldn't endure being around someone who refused to pretend, couldn't maintain their own facades in your presence. You didn't destroy anyone. You simply existed in a way that made their performance exhausting. The people who departed your life didn't leave because you wounded them. They left because remaining near you required them to be genuine, and being genuine was more painful than being isolated. The psychologist understood that you weren't the predator in these dynamics. You were the mirror, and people destroyed themselves against you, attempting to maintain illusions you never asked them to abandon. What disturbed them most was examining your response to betrayal, abuse, abandonment, all the experiences that create monsters in their case studies. Normal people respond with rage, retaliation, or collapse into victimhood. You responded with observation, integration, and transformation. You didn't pursue vengeance. You pursued comprehension. You didn't blame others. You analyzed the dynamics and extracted wisdom. You didn't become embittered. You became sharper. Every experience that should have damaged you simply refined you further, like you were using suffering as a whetstone to sharpen your awareness. That response pattern doesn't exist in their literature because their literature assumes pain breaks people or hardens them. Never that pain could be transmuted into wisdom without residue of bitterness. They attempted to locate your breaking point, the threshold where your intensity would transform into aggression or your authenticity would fracture into performance. They observed you under pressure, in conflict, during loss, in moments where performing would be most advantageous. You never fractured, never performed, never compromised your essential nature, even when it cost you everything. That consistency terrified them because every human they'd studied possessed a breaking point, a threshold where they'd abandon their values to protect themselves, but you protected your authenticity more fiercely than you protected your safety, comfort, or social position. You'd rather lose everything than pretend to be diminished. And that level of commitment to self isn't observed in their discipline outside of extreme pathology. The psychologist concluded that your pattern is no pattern at all in the traditional sense. It's simply consistent operation at a level of consciousness that appears patternless because it's not motivated by fear, ego, or social conditioning. You don't act to secure approval, avoid rejection, or manipulate outcomes. You act from a place of integrated awareness that's so foreign to their understanding of human motivation that it registers as threatening simply because it's unexplainable. You're not following any framework they've witnessed, not executing any strategy they recognize, not pursuing any objective they comprehend. You're simply being fully and without compromise. And that pure existence without agenda is the most unsettling thing they've ever encountered because it cannot be predicted, controlled, or understood using any framework built on analyzing fear-based behavior. Here.